lectures, we have seen broadly two topics, but really big topics. We have seen an introduction to tropical limnology, and then we have seen a couple of lectures on dams and how they interact with rivers and streams in terms of the discontinuity and fragmentation of the systems. And in between that, I have also included and introduced you to many of the fundamentals and the concepts of limnology in terms of rivers. So we have seen that transversally to how everything that we have talked. Now we're gonna see a more applied part of limnology, something more related with human activity, and this lecture in particularly is gonna be on urban streams, multiple stressors, and adaptation in extreme environments. And we're gonna work on this lecture and seeing how urban streams can be actually extreme environments, something that maybe not think about it too much. All right. So, yeah. So first, well, this is a picture of an extreme example of an urban stream. But you see there is a lot of pavement and a lot of infrastructure. If you think back of what we have seen in our lectures, what effects and what functions are not working in this system, as we see it in this photo. What functions, and I'm thinking, when you're thinking about a natural flowing system with all its connectivity in the 4 dimensions that we have talked, what do you think is being changed in this system, in an urban stream?
Will definitely not have the hyperreal, it was called.
Yes, so vertical connectivity is completely destroyed here. So the flow that we're seeing here is, as you see, basically is not flowing water, and it's not flowing basically because the hyporheic zone is disconnected. So the water table cannot flow inside the system. So this system is only dependent on the flashy or the flows that come out of the water system of the city and when it rains. So that's a huge disconnect. And what that means for fauna, that basically there's no constant flow of water. So life is really limited in this section. Okay, so that dimension is definitely being changed. What other changes do you imagine happening in the river or in a system crossing an urban stream, or cruising through an urbanized area? More? Yeah.
The same question, I did not get the...
What else? What else is
What
going
else?
on? You have one, but there's many more things happening in a stream happening into an urban settlement. Well, so let's dig into what are the differences and what are the main effects. So an urban stream basically is a stream that drains through urban land, and what happens is that it shows a consistent degradation pattern, and this is actually encapsulated in a concept known as the urban stream syndrome. So what is a syndrome? A syndrome is a recurring characteristic set of symptoms or responses that constantly appear together across different places or situations. So basically it's a group of symptoms that constantly happen. So that's why we hear it also in medical terms. And in this case, that led to the author of the urban stream syndrome concept, so Walsh, to encapsulate it in this set. So basically, when we see it in a multiple stressor context, an urban system or an urban stream suffers changes in terms of its hydrology, pollution, geomorphic instability, and also in biodiversity. And what we're seeing here is a normal or a free-flowing or at least a natural flowing system with connections in 4 dimensions. And then we have another example of urban stream where we have changes all in the vertical dimension of connectivity. Also, so many times there's gonna be longitudinal changes in connectivity because there's also other constructions built inside systems. And these are systems that are perfect laboratories for studying rapid evolution and physiological adaptation, because the organisms that live in these systems have to adapt to really harsh environments, as we're going to see in the following slides. So when we think urban, yes?
I did not get what consistent degradation means for the stream.
Consistent degradation. Well, I'm gonna develop more the urban stream system syndrome in the next slides. So I hope it's clear there. If not, we will retake it. So, what is the main thing when we think about a city? What is a city made of? Concrete. That's it. Concrete. And concrete has a particular property which is really important for water. And that is impervious. So water cannot cross through it. And that's why we use it basically to build our dry and solid buildings and all of our constructions. But this has huge impacts in the water cycle and the regular flow of water. And the imperviousness of concrete and human infrastructure, it's so huge now that it can be seen from space, as we're seeing it in this map made in a study from 2000 with data from 2015 to 2016 from satellite image. And basically what it's seen is the impervious fraction of land in the world. And well, there's no surprise that we're seeing that in the impervious areas in the latitudinal axis, we're seeing that the biggest area of impervious surfaces are in North America, Europe, and Asia. So basically, where the biggest settlements of humans are in the world. And basically, these are the places where streams have to overcome, when the streams turn urban and they have to overcome all of the challenges that we're gonna see in front. And I'm gonna develop more what the imperviousness of infrastructure has to do with river flows. But here I wanted to take the chance to show you a little example of something that I touched in another of our lectures, and is the importance of landscape ecology when we're trying to understand rivers or any new question in ecology. And basically this is an example for how land use changes due to urban settlements in a catchment. And this is basically the present when this study was done. And this was a projection of how it was going to be in the next 5 years, and here in the next 10 years. And we are seeing is basically that the land use, separated by the different colors, is changing constantly in this urban catchment due to basic urban expansion. And this is a trend that is seen all around the world, not only in this European context, but we are seeing more and more in the tropical and in developing countries. And in red, we are seeing the impervious surfaces. These are basically the residential areas. And what we're seeing is that it's heavily increasing in respect of the ratio of the catchment areas. And the yellow ones are agriculture, the green ones forest. So what we're seeing is that the humans have huge impact in small catchments around urban settlements, and that this has definitely some effects in the water systems, and we're gonna see how. So the urban stream syndrome. So there's a consistent ecological response to urbanization. That's basically what the syndrome entails. So there's an ecological response, and it's consistent in urban streams. And this is driven primarily by urban stormwater runoff. So that is not so easy to come to mind when you're thinking about urban streams. But what is happening is that there's a huge interaction between the impervious infrastructure and how the hydrological cycle of urban streams work. Why? Because when water precipitates into cities, they fall not impervious or mostly not impervious on pervious substrates like forest and grassland and agricultural land, but they fall on human-made infrastructure that is made to drain the water through drainage systems, and to do it fastly to avoid flooding. And all of this stormwater runoff comes out from the cities into the water bodies at a much faster rate and in a much bigger or higher intensity than it will do it naturally. And this in turn shapes the ecology of the rivers that run through urban systems, as we have discussed before with the natural flow paradigm from POF in other of our lectures. All right. That in terms, and in this video,
Austin's lakes and creeks are essential to our city, providing drinking water and recreational opportunities. But these same water...
What? So in this video, we're gonna see basically how this works for cities, the impervious cover, and how storm water is recollected and affects the rivers that cross.
Lakes and creeks are essential to our city, providing drinking water and recreational opportunities. But these same waterways can create problems such as flooding, erosion, and water pollution. When it rains, the soil absorbs some of the rainfall. The rest becomes overland flow called stormwater runoff. It flows off of property and reaches the drainage system or a creek. This simulator shows how natural areas absorb rainfall. Let's pretend this sponge is a grassy area. As you can see, the water is easily absorbed by the sponges. The creek in this model was able to accommodate the stormwater runoff. This type of surface, one that allows water to easily soak into the soil, is called a pervious area. This represents a parking lot, a type of impervious cover. Impervious cover also includes roofs, driveways, and patios, and other areas where the landscape cannot easily absorb the rainfall. This time, the creek is not able to handle this amount of rainfall in such a short time, causing flooding for these houses. Let's look at a different situation. Let's reduce the amount of impervious area in the parking lot. These sponges can represent landscaping. The resulting flow is less than with the entire parking lot. If we compare our bottles, we can see the different amounts of stormwater generated by the natural area, the parking lot in combination of natural area, and the parking lot. This model shows the effect of stormwater runoff in a creek, but the same holds true for a roadside ditch or a storm drain. As stormwater runoff increases, our drainage system needs to be more robust to help prevent flooding, erosion, and water pollution. For more information, please visit the website on the screen.
Okay, well, so that made really clear how the impervious area is a problem for urban rivers. And basically, for the urban stream syndrome, that is the main cause of all the symptoms on the stream. So basically, the storm flow changes water quality, morphology, light, and organic matter, and in turn that affects the biota in terms of the composition of fish biodiversity, invertebrate biodiversity, algal biomass, and in turn of the function or the biogeochemical functions that a river normally has, as its respiration, production, nutrient uptake, and leaf breakdown. Now, in the next slides, I'm going to break down each one of the symptoms of a sick urban stream that has all of these. So first, we go with the hydrological alteration. So this is how a storm flow a storm hydrograph works. Basically, this graph here, the orange ones, are the precipitation. So when there's a peak rainfall, there is a lag time between the rain and the flow inside the river. Normally there's a lag time between, depending on the system, there's a normal lag time. It reaches peak discharge, and then steadily it starts going down until it reaches the base flow here in the bottom. But when we have a storm flow in a city, what we normally see is that the lag time is reduced. So we have a steeper beginning of the curve, and the peak discharge is reached faster and in a higher magnitude, and also the falling limb is also steeper. So, and this basically has to do with the hydraulic efficiency of the drainage. So how much impervious covers we have, and how good are they into taking the water from the impervious surfaces directly to the water system. So there's an hydrological alteration, and obviously when we have an hydrological alteration, we have an affection of the natural flow regime, which in turn have ecological consequences. Then we have water quality degradation, because the storm water flow doesn't come with clean water. Basically what we're seeing is that the storm flow is washing all of the surfaces of the city, and is basically taking all the pollutants as nutrients, metals, hydrocarbons, and pesticides, and they're coming out of the stormwater system of cities into the water system without being treated. In most of the cities, there are rare cities where a stormwater goes through wastewater treatment plants. This creates episodic pollution pulses. So the organisms in an urban stream have to be adapted or have to survive to these episodes of high pollution. And also, most of the wastewater treatments cannot take or usually overflow when there's stormwater leakages, and this creates big problems with emerging contaminants like pharmaceuticals and other. Then ecological consequences. These two things together, the stormwater flow together with the pollutants that this entail, usually bring us to differential or different compositions of freshwater fauna. And one of the most used bioindicators of this is the loss of the sensitive taxa and sensitive species, which are known as the EPT taxa, and also the loss of some native sensitive fish. In terms of insects, usually in cities, on urban streams, it's really rare to find these species: Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. These are EPT for the initial letters. And why is this? Because basically we're losing the normal habitat and the natural flow regime where they were. Well, they will be. Usually these species require high oxygen consumption, and also they are shredders, so they live out of breaking organic material, basically leaves. And what is happening is that in urban streams, the flow is rare, and when it's happened, it comes flashy with the stormwater. So this clears off normally all the organic material that we will find. Also, we don't have the normal substrate in many of the reaches. We only have concrete. So usually we won't find these species. And also the native and sensitive species, and we're thinking on urban streams in Europe, sensitive species will be, for example, salmonids. So it will be really rare to find trout, forelle in a urban stream. And we find a common pattern that is seen in affected ecosystems, which is the dominance of tolerant species, tolerant and opportunistic species. So what we usually find is still of a rich system with a different species. What we find, for example, is a dominance of chironomids, so larvae of mosquito, and some other diptera, 3-4 species, and that's it. And this basically is an altered food web, and that also reduces the ecosystem function because, as I will tell you, they are shredders, and they will usually be breaking the organic matter, and that's something that is not happening in this system. And in the urban stream syndrome, what we see is basically this relation between the biological condition and the imperviousness or the urban density. So basically, the more impervious area in a catchment, the lower the biological condition. And we're talking about biological condition, we're talking about biodiversity and the functions, ecological functions they bring. This could have different behaviors, but in general, it's a loss of this biological condition with increasing imperviousness. Other thing that is interesting or important to consider when we're talking about urban streams is that these urban streams are chemically extreme environments. So as I was telling you, the fresh water that runs through urban streams in storm flows normally bring chemical pollution with it. And one of the key pollutants that have been recorded that have been increasing drastically with urban encroachment of landscape is the salt, or salts, because there's not only one salt. These are basically among the most pervasive urban pollutants, and they lead to the broader freshwater salinization syndrome. So we're jumping from the urban salinization syndrome to another syndrome related with urban expansion, which is the freshwater salinization syndrome. And in this graph here from the paper that talks about this syndrome is telling us that story basically. So this is the chloride concentration. So if you know the salt that we use for cooking is sodium chloride, and so we have the ion chloride as one of the, let's say, a proxy of the amount of salt in water. And then we have the years from the 1900s to 2020, and we have a lot of big rivers around the world. We have the Rhine but taken and sampled in Switzerland, here in these bowls down here. But what we're seeing in general from all the world is an increase in chloride ions constantly in time since the 1900s. Okay. So we know there's salt coming into freshwater system, and there's a syndrome that is being referenced. But then here I ask you, where does salt come from in the urban streams? Like, and there's not only one salt, the many salts. Where do you think they come? And what impacts do you imagine they have on organisms that live in freshwater? Yeah. And when we're talking about urban catchments, I'm not talking only about houses, like as we saw in the Polish example. An urban catchment have different types of cover. So there's agriculture, there's industry, there's many things that happen in an urban catchment. What salts are produced there, and what do they get to the urban streams? Any clues?
One thing I imagine is the salt put on the streets in winter.
That's a really important thing, and it's important for specifically the places that get snow during winter. And they are highly used, and they have been found, and there's a lot of research around as being one of the sources of salt pollution. Yeah. Okay, so there's salts coming in, but how do you think they will impact freshwater organisms that live in a river? Yeah.
I think as there are different species in freshwater, in the I don't know how it's called, brackwasser zone between freshwater and sea, brackish zone in the sea. So I think many freshwater species will not be able to tolerate.
Yeah, that's one of the main impacts. Is basically they are not adapted for this kind of changes in the physicochemistry qualities of water. Okay, so we'll solve these questions together here in the slides, basically. So the freshwater salinisation syndrome. So there's increasing freshwater salinity at regional to continental scales, even global, as we saw in the last slides. And what drives this increase in water? Road salts, the one you were just saying, that are used to melt snow. There is wastewater. So basically the water that comes out of human, industrial and agricultural use. Then we have urban weathering, which is an important concept. So you saw all our infrastructure, the concrete and everything, it is not immortal. Actually, it breaks down with water slowly, but it does. And this process is called weathering, which is the geological breakdown of these materials, and they leak salts into the system. So all the water that comes out of the city with the stormwater flows and the regular catchment drainage, it comes with a higher concentration of salt pollution. Then we have mining as a big example. We're going to see some of that. And there's agriculture, because basically, for example, the lime that it's used for agriculture, and many of the products that are used there, like in huge quantities, have different components that are increasing salt in the systems. So salinization is not only table salt going to the water, it's actually a chemical cocktail. So we are talking about ions with metals, nutrients, and radionuclides together, getting into the freshwater system and having impacts on it. And it's basically an alteration of the water chemistry, because salinization also comes together or has a direct relationship with alkalinization, so having a higher pH, and solidification. And what we're seeing in a graph here is how basically this works. We have atmospheric inputs, so also rain brings ions together with it. We also have geological pools, so natural rivers run through different systems with different geology, and depending of the rocks that are made of that catchment, we have like a normal background of salinity. But then we also have so that's why we're talking about the sedimentary lithology. So if we have a sedimentary landscape, we have higher salinity coming into it. And if we have a more of a stable lithology, then we have not such a big intrusion of salts. But then we have human accelerated weathering. So that's why we're talking about cities, when there's breaking of the human infrastructure, and there's cation exchange and mineral dissolution, and this comes into the water system. Then we have the hydrological modifications that we were talking, basically the storm flow changing through the cities, and this brings also other increased human inputs, the ones we talked, road salts, agricultural lime, wastewater, and the mines. And well, all of this together basically increases the total dissolved solids, the specific conductance of the water, and increases also the pH in the water. And basically, some of the effects are drinking water contamination, the mobilization of metals and nutrients, and also, well, if the rivers come to the sea, they reduce the acidification of the oceans, and also have effects on the CO2 sequestration. Well, basically, and we were talking, we have natural causes and anthropogenical causes. We touched it in the other graph. But when we were talking about ecological impacts of freshwater salinizations, basically we have a shift in a species composition and the stress on aquatic fauna. We have a loss of biodiversity and habitat degradation. We have altered food webs dynamics, changes in nutrient cycling, and effects on ecosystem services. So when we think about the freshwater salinization syndrome, we can think about it as actually a syndrome that is also encapsulated in the urban stress syndrome, because they have both the same effects, but they are one works inside the other one. Basically, salinity is one of the effects of the urban expansion. And well, interestingly, there has been a lot of interest in the past around the globe with nutrients. So that has been one of the driving forces of limnology and ecological interest from the urban stream effects, or the urban effects on river systems. So there has been a lot of legislation on changing how many nutrients we put into water, and that has been having an effect on rivers. For example, here in Maryland, where they have been measuring total nitrogen, which is one of the key nutrients in ecosystems, nitrogen together with phosphorus, and there has been a decrease from the input of that into this river since the 1970s, when they passed the laws regarding this, until 2016. But as salinity didn't get as much as attention as nutrients, there has not been a lot of legislations with it. We're seeing a steadily increase on the inputs together with the decrease of nutrients. So this is only to bring to attention that salinity is an emergent problem that we're gonna be seeing constantly. And there's a lot of effort to bring to this attention in management. And what are the ecological and physiological impacts of salinity? One of the key ones for freshwater fauna is the osmoregulatory stress. And what is osmoregulatory stress? Basically, all organisms that live in water, and in this case in freshwater, have to actively keep ions out of their bodies. So, incorrect, sorry. They have to bring, that will be in salt water. In fresh water, they have to actively take up ions through their gills. And basically they drink little water, but they have really diluted urine to keep the regulation of ions in their bodies actively. And for that, they spend energy. So it's a physiologically demanding activity they have to entail. And when you have an activity or an organism has physiological activity that requires a lot of energy, if you change the magnitude of that activity, putting more ions in the water, basically the organism has to take or deviate the energy consumption to keep that regulation of ions. And when they have to do that more, well, they lose fitness. Basically, they have less weight, less reproduction, and can lead to many sublethal effects or even lethal effects. So we're talking about pollution and ecotoxicology in regarding salinity as a pollutant. Also, salinity, when we're talking about salinity, when there's increasing salinity, as we're seeing in these graphs, there's also the mobility of metals. Here, heavy metals, that we're seeing here in the case with copper. So there's a mobilization of metals and contaminants, and we are seeing an increasing inclusion of toxicant mixtures in the rivers. There's a loss of sensitive microinvertebrates and fish, as we saw again with the urban stream system, and there's an altered microbial process, biogeochemical cycling. Basically, when we have all of this salinity, all the freshwater microorganisms that normally will be in the system and that they keep the biogeochemical cycling are affected, change, and normally they change to be only dominated by a few species that cannot do the normal ecosystem processes. And urbanization amplifies this problem because, okay, salinity occurs naturally from, let's say, volcanic activities, atmospheric deposition, geological process, but activities as human, agricultural practices, wastewater discharge and urbanization, and the road salt use all magnify the problem and of freshwater salinization. There are seasonal extremes. For example, there's huge winter pulses due to the road salt use and increasing water discharge. And there's a concentration in the summer. So basically, when you lose volumes of water, the water gets salty, depending on the system and how far it is discharged. All right. So that was in terms of salt in the urban systems and the urban stream syndromes. Now, another huge effect, and that we have touched a little bit with salinity, is chemical pollution coming from urban settlements. So rivers basically receive huge complex mixtures made of pharmaceuticals, pesticides, metals, PFAS, and industrial chemicals. Big example here this is untreated effluents going out of a factory in Russia directly to the freshwater system. This is not so common in the European Union due to the regulation, but this really common and is the biggest percentage of wastewater goes untreated into the freshwater ecosystems around the world. There are effects of pollutants, and usually or often in the natural ecosystems they are chronic, sublethal, and mixture driven. This is important because, okay, there's a few times where there are lethal effects where we're seeing like huge massive death of organisms. For example, in the Oda river, like 2 years ago, there was a huge death or die-off of fish that was linked actually with salt pollution. But that was not directly the salt that created this huge die-off in the Oda. It was like the salt came and it changed the water balance and created an algae bloom, and it was an algae that was highly toxic for freshwater fish, and that created a huge die-off of fish in the Oda. But these are outlier cases. Normally what we are seeing is that the effects are chronic and sublethal. So they are beyond what we see. There are changes sometimes in the populations, sometimes in the fitness of organisms, but we don't see it directly. And examples of it are endocrine disruptor chemicals, also changes in development, immunity, behavior, and microbiomes are some of the examples of chronic and sublethal effects of pollutants. And it's important to know that conventional risk assessment really struggles with low dose mixture and emerging contaminants. So in the conventional risk assessment, what we are looking for is the lethal effects of pollution, and these are not easily seen, as I was telling you. So I wanted to bring you an interesting example of this pollution with its sublethal effects, and is the case of the endocrine disruption in fish with the EE2, which is the active component of anti-baby pills. So I don't know if they use it currently, but when this study was done, it was used in North America. So basically, this study is pretty interesting because in Ontario, in Canada, they have something called the experimental lakes. So they have actual real natural lakes, which they can do ecosystem-wide exposures of pollutants. And in this case, what they did was that they exposed with natural occurring levels of this pollutant, not natural, but at least the levels that can be found in cities. They expose a lake and they compare it with reference lakes, and they were checking on the effects on this fish, the American minnow. And what they found, for example, in this graph here is the concentration of BTG, which is basically biloteginin, which is the component of the female eggs. And we found a huge increase with the time since exposure. And this is telling us that there was a loss of male fish in terms of 5 years. And it's so drastic that actually at the end of the experiment, the whole population collapsed because there were no more males. All of the fish feminized, and they only had females at the end of the experiment. So this is an example of how an urban effluent can change completely a freshwater ecosystem. And this was done in a manipulative experiment, but there has also been examples of this found in lakes in Switzerland and rivers in Europe. So this has already happened, and basically it's because these endocrine disruptors can escape the regular wastewater treatments in the cities. And here it's important that we understand a little bit of wastewater treatment. Basically, the water that we use in the cities is pumped through a wastewater treatment system. In the primary part of the process, the solids are removed. In this section, the sludge, so all of the solids are taken out of the system, and usually they can be reused depending on the toxicity they have. Then comes the secondary treatment, where there's biological treatment with chemicals, with bacteria, and aeration. So breakdown of all the organic matter. And in the most advanced wastewater treatments, we have the tertiary or advanced treatment, where there's use of activated carbon, ozonation, or membranes to actually take out persistent pollutants as the ones we were seeing in the case before with the fish. But this is really rare. Only few countries in the world actually have this. Few cities have it. There is a big push in Switzerland, in Germany, to include it in legislation, and at least in the biggest cities. So maybe there's going to be a big change on that soon. There's also the example of nature-based solutions for treating the wastewater outlets. Sorry. And we've seen an example of here in Italy where they took the stormwater runoff that we were seeing as a big impact on our urban systems, and they put the outlets to go through a constructed wetland, and from the wetlands to run through a pond, and from the pond to finally go to the local river. This is really important. It has been tested in many systems and do have important effects. For example, it really increases the retention time. As we were seeing, one of the biggest effects of urban streams or urbanization is the flashiness of the hydrograph. So the fast change of how water passes, the fast change in the water passing through the system. So this increases the retention time, and therefore also increases the time that biological processes can do the breakdown of many pollutants, and there's a huge increase in water quality going to the river again. So this is one solution, but it doesn't fix everything. Still, there's big impacts, or there's a need to tackle persistent pollutants and micropollutants, but it has also co-benefits. It's not only increasing the retention time and enhancing natural degradation, but it also increases biodiversity, carbon storage, and it's also good to counteract floods. And we're seeing more and more of this in the planning of cities. For example, the Aachen city has already one project working, and there is more to come, and we see it more and more in Europe all the time. So with both syndromes that we saw, they encapsulate all of the problems, or most of the problems, that had led to the creation of one of the world's more relevant and best made so far directives for water management, which is the EU Water Framework Directive, which has been made basically to increase the water quality of urban systems and how we interact as humans with water. It was adopted in the 2000s to achieve a good ecological status for all EU waters. It manages not only the rivers, but lakes, groundwater, and coasts through different river basin districts. So it's not country-based, but it's for where the river flows. So the Rhine, it has not only one country, but it's treated as an entire district. Then it integrates the quantity, quality, and ecological health. So not only focus on the flow of water and the quantities of water, but also the organisms that run through it. And it requires constant monitoring, public participation, and it's done in a 6-year management cycle. What we're seeing in this graph is basically a recapitulation of how good has been the quality, or are we reaching a good ecological status. And what we're seeing is that yes, it is increasing since the time of implementation and before that until the current days. It's the qualities in terms of geomorphology and in terms of organisms is improving, but we are not yet reaching a good quality in terms of ecosystem health, but we're getting there. And with that, I wanted you to have this idea in mind from what we've seen. Basically, urban streams are extreme environments where hydrology, pollution, and salinity converge and can influence the adaptative and non-adaptative evolution in organisms. So it's not only that we have polluted systems, it's that these polluted and impacted systems are actually an evolutionary pressure for the organisms that live in it. So we are not only changing the systems and the rivers that flow through our cities, we are also driving forces of evolution as humans. And this is what we're seeing in this interesting newspaper or journal article, which is the concept that brings to the front the concept of urban evolution, which is actually a concept that is currently has a lot of research going on, and it's telling the story of the Urban Ecology Research Lab in Washington, and it's showing us how creatures are evolving with our cities. And they take some examples. They work on with fish and these spiders that have been changing with cities basically, and they are getting bigger. not as big as buildings, but they are growing and they are reproducing more and more in cities. And there's many examples of urban evolution, and that has been one of my interests in research for the past few years, is how urban streams change ecosystems and fauna. And I'm gonna take a few minutes to show you some of my research related to that specific topic. So we have seen a lot of conceptual limnology in the past slides and in the past classes, and now this is gonna be the chance to see a more of application. So how does turns into science and what I have been doing in regards to limnology and all of these topics. So here in this picture, this was a sampling I did in Spain with a professor that helped me there. And what we're seeing here in the back looks like snow. It's actually a huge mountain of salt coming out of a potash mine in industry. And this salt is just laid there to make a huge mountain. It's not covered, and it can be in the system forever. Basically, they separate the salt from the potassium that they use for fertilizers, and they just make huge mountains of that. They leave it there, and no clue. There's no surprise that when it rains, the rain that comes out of that mountain is really saline. Basically, it goes at levels of salt higher than the ocean in the peak storm flows. So again, all of these concepts get together to that. But for understanding what I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna go a little bit back, because this is a bit more of a applied study. So I use omics. And when we're talking about omics, then we're talking about molecular biology, which is its founder, or the person who first established the field, Asbury, in the 1960s, said basically is the search into the genesis and function of life from the molecular plan. So before that, everyone was looking at life from the bigger to the smallest. Then Asbury said, no, let's look at life from the smallest molecule up. And now, from that start in 1960s, now we have come to what is known the omics era of science, where we're capable of taking huge screenshots of the entire molecules of an organism or a tissue. So we have different types of omics. We have transcriptomics, genomics, proteomics, and metabolomics. Basically, when we're talking about transcriptomics, we're talking about messenger RNA. When we're talking about genomics, we're talking about all the DNA on a sample or an organism. Proteomics, well, the proteins, and metabolomics, the metabolites. These advances allow us to characterize the whole pool of biological molecules of a sample. These are not so widely used in environmental sciences. We're getting more and more into it, even in ecotoxicology. It wasn't so common until, like, let's say 3-4 years ago, when we started to see it more and more. It has been mainly used in cancer, biomedical, microbiology, in general, human health related sciences, because basically they're really pricey and they were quite complex to implement. But as I told you, the tides are changing now. An example in ecotoxicology, here we're seeing the different fields of omics and how the number of studies has increased since the 2000s. Quite high in a yearly basis, and these are the species where omics studies have been mostly focused, and what we're seeing here is that it's been usually more in model organisms. So now, as I see, there are more and more resources that we can use to understand omics, but there's still some drawbacks. And the biggest drawback of all is the biological knowledge. So sometimes people get to the analysis, which is also a drawback, or let's say a filter for people to use it, because it's not so easy, but it's getting easier and easier, or more accessible, but still the biological knowledge is not there so easily to take. And in my work, I use a lot of transcriptomics. As I told you, is the comprehensive analysis of RNA, or the transcripts, to assess gene expression across the entire genome. And what is used for? So basically, imagine that you expose an organism to a pollutant. When you expose it, there's a whole mechanism of inside that organism to counteract that pollution or that stressor, and that creates or leads to the expression of genes. Let's take about detoxification genes or transporter genes, all of that. When we take a sample of that organism after exposure, we can see the entire the entire, let's say, infrastructure, or the entire mechanisms of messenger RNA, and link it to physiological and ecological metrics that we can bridge to these molecular mechanisms. And we can bridge that with ecological outcomes. So we can link that from the smallest molecule to the entire ecological processes. So transcriptomics are highly sensitive, and they allow us to measure physiological performance, pinpointing specific molecular pathways and processes impacted by stressors. That is really important, because many times in ecotoxicology we see, okay, there's an effect. The organism dies, the organism starts flying, or the ice changes. But with transcriptomics and molecular biology, what we can see is the mechanisms. So understand which genes are involved in these changes, in what and how do they change, basically. So with that framework, we go into the studies I performed during my doctoral thesis, as an example, which was basically this: basic physiological responses of freshwater fish to multiple stressors in urban rivers, a transcriptomic approach. So all the concepts that we have been talking get together in this highly detailed mechanistical approach of how urban rivers affect physiology of fish, and not only if they are affected, but how. What are the mechanisms of this change? For the first chapter of that thesis, what I did was a study with sticklebacks, Asterosteus aculeatus, and I took 3 stations in a river close to Essen called the Emscher catchment. That's the Boya River. And I took 3 stations with different concentrations of salt occurring there, due to the different levels of urbanization. So we have a reference site which has a level of salinity closer to what normally you find in the boya. Then one where there's more storm flow and weathering with a middle level of salinity, and a third location with a high level of salinity. Then in the field, I took the fish, I extracted the gill tissue, performed a RNA extraction, did all the bioinformatic magic, and then what I got at the end was the difference of the genes that were expressed in the samples in the reference location compared to the polluted station. And each little line on this heat map is showing you a gene, and what we basically are seeing are two clusters of genes that are only happening in the station that is polluted compared to the reference station. So that's a differential gene expression analysis. And then this is telling you, okay, there's a lot of genes that are changing, and they are changing consistently between the stations of the reference against the polluted site. Okay, so there is a physiological response. But what is this physiological response? Then I took all of the genes that were coming out of this analysis and I passed it through a database known as the gene ontology database, which is basically a database that has each gene sequence, and there's annotations made by scientists that have been doing experiments all a long time, and they know or they have annotated what are the mean what does this gene do in terms of physiology. And what I found basically is that these clusters are related with transmembrane transport, regulation of transport, and osmoregulation pathways. And I was actually able to make a biomarker list of genes related with osmoregulation in this river, and related directly with the urban stream syndrome and the freshwater salinisation. So out of this paper, there's now a list of biomarkers that someone can use to check if there is a salinization impact on fish in a system. All right. Yeah, that was the publication. And then what I did is, that was a sublethal effect and a subtle change on salinity. For my second chapter, what I did was the study where I show you the big mountain of salt in Spain. There, I took one station in a reference site upstream of that mountain, and then one below that with a huge level of salinity. And then I took fish that were actually able to adapt to that system. It's an invasive species, this hybrid European minnow. And I took 3 different tissues. In the other study, I only used gills, but in this study, I used brains, gills, and liver. I did extraction of the RNA, did the entire bioinformatical part, and I was able to find also genes that were changing in the salt stations in relation to the reference stations. And what happened here was pretty interesting, because we were not only finding changes in osmoregulations, they were kind of obvious that we were going to find, but we found that in these levels of salinity, there's an affection in terms of immunity and stress so the metabolism, the osmoregulation, and the immune systems are being affected. So the level of stress is already affecting the physiology of the organisms and will clearly have impacts on its fitness. And what is most interesting is that this is a non-native species that has been adapted to this system, as I was telling you with the urban evolution. So this experiment or this finding is directly related with that, and it's basically showing us how species that are highly resilient can take the places of native species and change entire communities of organisms. In the last in the last chapter of that thesis, we went a bit further and we took a native species that is more sensitive to freshwater salinization and in general stressors. This is the groppe or Cotus renanus, the European bullhead. It's a little fish that lives in the streams and in the bottom streams and eats microinvertebrates. And we took several stations, 6 stations during 2 seasons in a bigger catchment. Also in the one where I found the first study, but with more rivers in the entire catchment, so the Emsha, spanning from Dortmund to Duisburg. And we did a characterization of the anthropogenical stresses regarding saltwater pollution and physicochemical parameters. And what we found is that in the warmer season, in the rivers that crosses or that are more impacted by urban settlements, in this case they were around Dortmund, what we found is a higher in this season we found higher temperature, lower oxygen, and higher salinity. And what we found is a higher anthropogenic stress related with increased metabolic and immune response. So similar to what we found in the system in Spain, where there was a drastic effect of salinity that is quite non-normal for urban streams. And it was such a big sublethal effect that we could relate it to that kind of huge stressors. So in this case, we were able to relate urbanization as a main impact on physiology on fish. I'm not going to go into details into that, but that was in terms of that study. And current research that we're doing in the institute is, for example, this, which is pretty cool. We have a river called the Holteme that is in central Germany. And this river has been widely studied by the UFZ. And in this river we have a headwater that runs through a natural park, as we see in here. So this is the reference station. And then we have 2 human settlements. So we have urbanization and all the troubles that comes with it, as we have seen previously in the slides. And basically what we have there is sampling of 6 stations of Gamarus pulex, which is an amphipod. We did RNA extraction and the transcriptomic workflow. But what is different from this study is that we are not only studying the human impact in terms of urbanization, but we are also having a detailed chemical micropollution mapping of each station. And this is what we're seeing here. This is the micropollutants in the river Holteme. So we have the reference station, and we see how it increases with urbanization downstream. So we see in a clear gradient of chemical pollution. And these are the main mode of actions of the chemicals of this chemical profiling. And we are seeing that in the stations that are more urbanized, we're having higher neuroactive and cardiovascular system pollutants affecting the organisms. Okay, so we have that in terms of chemicals, but how that relates with physiology. So for that we perform the transcriptomics. What we're seeing is here the whole transcriptomical response of the different gamma rates from each station. And what we're seeing is that they are organized in the chemical gradient of pollution. So from the reference site to the most polluted site, which is the Holteme 7 station. So we see all the black dots. here to the right, and that's related with chemical pollution. And what we're seeing in these graphs is the changes of expression in each station compared to the reference site. So, for example, reference station against station 6, we're seeing that there's a lot of genes that are being upregulated, so a higher expression of genes, and some downregulated. And we're seeing the biggest level of expression just in magnitude for station 7, which basically takes all of the wastewater, the urban stream flow, with almost 4,000 genes. And same with station 4, that is right outside or right downstream a wastewater flow. And what this is telling us in terms of physiology is that basically the stations that are more polluted or have more impact or urbanization, as Joteme 7, have an enrichment of metabolic processes, cellular responses to stress, and there's also nervous system development, which is really important, as we saw with the micropollutants. Some of them were endocrine disruptors. So we are seeing a clear effect in terms of physiology and expression related with chemical pollution. So that's one of the current studies that we're doing in the institute regarding urban streams and chemical pollution and urbanization. There's a suggested reads for this lecture, and I will upload this to our Moodle repository. So, well, I went a bit fast at the end. I just wanted to give you a little starter of what kind of science is done in the institute, what I'm particularly doing there, and well, let you know that this is an active line of research, and if any of you are interested in taking part, you're more than welcome. Mostly what I do is that I use molecular tools to understand stress. I'm not limited to the freshwater ecosystems or fish. I also been working recently with also really different things. I've been working with European owls also in a collaboration with Spain, where we're checking out how rodenticides and urbanization affect a really endangered species as the European owl, which is the biggest nocturnal raptor in the world. And for that, I use all of these molecular tools and all of this setup. So yeah, that's it. I will be glad if you have any question, or like particularities or how something is done, or the floor is open for any question.
The second project you mentioned, I now thought the rodenticides with the European owl.
Yeah.
I immediately thought about the place where my grandparents come from, which is in the countryside. And
yes.
I've got a friend there who spends a lot of time in the forest and knows everything where the animals are. And he knows one place of a European owl.
Yeah.
He has observed that this owl hunts extremely the buzzards and the red kites.
Yeah.
Which did not seem normal to us, but around his nesting site, it's all full of the feathers, and he knows where the birds have disappeared.
Well, they're basically the peak of the entire ecosystem there.
Yes.
Like they are the biggest predator in the night, and they not only feed out of what you will think like small mammals, but they do go for other stuff. I must say that I would have been happy to do part of the field work of that study, but it was done by veterinaries on Spain. But what is interesting in that study in particular is that in the more urbanized areas, of course, there are more pests, so there are more rats, so there are more rodenticides used. But well, and basically it's the highest prey abundance that they have, so rats. And so the the father owls bring this to the nest. They feed it to the chicks. But the thing is, what's happening is that the rodenticides, the rats are getting adapted to rodenticides. So that's what we were seeing with urban evolution. So nowadays they can take more and more concentration of rodenticide because this basically is a disruptor of protein K cycle, and they have been able to change this. The rats, they are well, that's why we have it as pests, because they are really good at evolving and adapting. So they are bringing these rats to the chicks, and what we're seeing in terms of physiology is basically an affection of fitness, immune system. So basically the chicks are getting sick, and they are not growing as fast. Some of them have higher mortality.
Okay, so the question is a completely different one.
Yeah.
I thought in the way, okay, if you give rodenticides, then you have less, and then the owl might go for other prey, which it is on top of the ladder, but still.
That could be a change. The thing is, maybe I don't know how urban is the location where you're. It's not so
there
urban.
Are many villages every 2 kilometers. There is one.
But it's not such a heavy use of rodenticides. That's the difference, because here we're talking about a city, so it's Murcia, which is a big city in Spain, and we're talking about mountains that are part of the natural park around the city. And yeah, that's where this study goes. But that, of course, will have at some point some issues in the ecological flows and how the entire connectivity of the system works. Like these have cascade effects on entire assemblages of specimens. And maybe at some point will lead to that. Yeah, probably they will, or maybe they try not to feed so much on rats because they know they're sick and they go for birds. That could be one thing. Yeah. Write it in. We will see each other, I think, for last lecture, no? Last lecture next week. And yeah. Still.